So in chapter 1, we went over the hierarchy of biological organization. And you'll remember that starts with atoms, and then it goes to molecules, and then macromolecules. So in chapter 3, we're really going to that macromolecule level, that biomolecule level. And in chapter 2, you learned about atoms and molecules and bonds. And so we're going to keep going, and we're moving on now to the macromolecule level. So we're in the molecule and the macromolecule level. We'll be bouncing back and forth in that part of the hierarchy. So just to help you keep track of where we are. And so you can see in this chapter, chapter 3, the chemical building blocks of life, we're going to start talking about what we call organic molecules. In this case, organic means molecules that have a skeleton structure made of carbon. So organic in this context means carbon-based. And so we will start by talking about something called hydrocarbons, which are the simplest organic molecules. And then we'll talk about atoms that are then bonded to that structure to make particular biomolecules or macromolecules. We will talk about the basic type of reactions that happen to build biomolecules or to break them down. And then we'll go through some very basic information about what are the 4 categories, the main categories of the biomolecules or macromolecules. So you'll notice I'm using those terms interchangeably. And so in this first part of the lecture, we'll talk generally about the organic molecules. And then in the second and third parts of the lecture, we'll dive into some details about each of the 4 categories. And so it may be helpful to make, when we get to that point, to make a little chart in your notes to keep those details aligned with the name of each category. But for right now, we're talking about very general organic compounds. So the title of this slide, it says carbon provides the framework of biological molecules. Carbon can form up to 4 covalent bonds. In fact, carbon always likes to form 4 covalent bonds because that satisfies the octet rule for each carbon atom. And so what you have at the simplest structural level of organic compounds would be carbon in sort of this central position. You can have 1 carbon, 2 carbons, 3 carbons, 4 carbons, as many as you want. There's all kinds of different molecules. And then covalently bonded to those carbons are hydrogen. So this molecule here would be an example of a molecule that can be classified as a hydrocarbon. So a hydrocarbon is a molecule of any size, but it only consists of carbon and hydrogen atoms. So this example is propane. You could just have 1 carbon, there could be 2 carbons, but those wouldn't be propane, they would have other names. We're not going to learn the names, but the concept is you can have any length of carbon atoms and then hydrogens. That's a hydrocarbon. And all hydrocarbons are nonpolar. And the reason is, you'll remember that the carbon to carbon covalent bond is nonpolar, and the carbon to hydrogen bond is nonpolar. And so if all the bonds in the molecule are nonpolar, then the molecule is nonpolar. So propane doesn't mix well with water. Any of the hydrocarbons, they don't mix well with water. They're hydrophobic. But this is just the basic or the skeleton structure of the biological molecules. Certainly, the biological molecules, many of them are going to mix with water. And so in order to have a molecule that can mix with water, we have certain groups of atoms that are typically attached to hydrocarbons, and these are going to contain oxygen and nitrogen. and that's going to add some polar bonds to these molecules and make them at least partially water soluble or fully water soluble, depending. So I'm going to show you what we call the functional groups, and I'm going to explain what it is you need to know about each of them and which ones you need to know. Okay, so these are called functional groups. Functional groups are groups of atoms that are covalently bonded together that repeatedly or very commonly appear attached to hydrocarbons. And so the name of the functional group is shown in this first column. And the ones that we're going to learn are called the hydroxyl group. That's the first one. So put a star next to hydroxyl. Let's see if I can get a pen going here. Okay. Then we're going to learn the carbonyl, and you can hear how I pronounce that, carbonyl group, and the carboxyl, right? And then we're going to learn amino and phosphate. Okay, so hear me out on these because it's not as hard as you might think. The first one is really the simplest one, hydroxyl. Hydroxyl is an oxygen that's then bonded to a hydrogen. They're not showing the bond in between the oxygen and the hydrogen because these two are so commonly found as a unit like this that they get lazy and they show it like this. And then the oxygen, is what's bonded to something else. So some other, some hydrocarbon, some larger molecule. So in this example here, here's the hydroxyl group here, and it's bonded to an ethyl group. So you have hydroxyl here, and then a 2-carbon hydrocarbon, let's put it that way. Anyway, and this is called ethanol, but you don't need to know the names of these. What you need to know is the name of the functional group. So when you see that O and that H together like that, you want to think hydroxyl group. So that's a hydroxyl group attached to the rest of this molecule, for example. So OH is hydroxyl. The next one is called carbonyl. You may want to call it carbonyl, but it's not. It's carbonyl. And the carbonyl group is also pretty small. It's a C, which is really part of the hydrocarbon, and then in a double bond with an oxygen. So if you see that anywhere, for example, right here, that's the carbonyl. So it doesn't matter what else is there. You're zooming in on these particular combinations of atoms that are attached to each other. That's what functional groups are. So the OH as a unit is the hydroxyl group. The C with a double bond to the O is a carbonyl group. The third one is, in a way, a combination of the first two, if you think about it. There is a carbonyl here, and there is a hydroxyl, and since they're both bonded to the same carbon, they are called carboxyl. So there's a C double bond O, which is a carbonyl, and a C bound to a hydroxyl. So when it all comes together like this, it's called carboxyl. It's almost a blending of the two individual names into a combined name. But you want to identify carboxyl. When you see both together, it's carboxyl. So those three, there's a certain, you want to look at that and practice those a little bit. The next two are each completely different. So the amino group is the only one that has a nitrogen in it, at least the only one that we're going to learn in this course. So there's a nitrogen, which I sort of accidentally marked out with my pen, and then it's bound to two hydrogens. And so in this example, it's right over here. One thing you'll notice on this example is over here you have a C double bond O and an OH. Even though it's turned backwards, it's facing the other direction, it's rotated around the other way, that is still a carboxyl right here. But technically we were trying to identify the amino, which is this N with 2 hydrogens, NH2 for short. All right. The last one is called the phosphate group. The phosphate group is a phosphorus, which is a P. And then all around that phosphorus, there are bonds to oxygen. So there's a double bond to this oxygen, and then a single bond, a single bond, a single bond. So it's phosphorus, P, and then oxygen all around, attached via one of the oxygens to the rest of the hydrocarbon molecule. So that's called the phosphate group. All right. So what you'll be asked to do in the practice, in the post-quiz, would be to identify by name these. So I'll show you an OH and I'll say this is called the blank group, and you'll choose hydroxyl. Or C double bond O, this is called the carbonyl group. Or NH2, this is called the amino group. Or C double bond O OH, this is called the carboxyl. Or P with 4 oxygens around it, this is the phosphate. So you want to practice with those, and just you're connecting the name to the combination of atoms that that group consists of. So I said memorize the name and structural formula of each. All right, so those are functional groups. Okay, we're going to change gears just for a minute. Again, we're still talking very generally about some characteristics of larger molecules. When you have very large molecules, it is possible for you to have 2 molecules who if you break down exactly the number and types of atoms that are in each of them, they seem to be the same makeup in terms of atoms, but the way the atoms are bonded together in one molecule is different than the arrangement of the way those same number and type of atoms is bonded in the other molecule. So when you have that case, that's called a structural isomer. Another word that starts with I, and I apologize for that. I didn't do it, but I apologize anyway. Structural isomers. So one example is glucose and fructose. Both glucose and fructose have a C6, that means 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. But the way that the carbons, the hydrogens, and the oxygens are bonded together is different in glucose than it is in fructose. And what that does is it creates 2 different molecules in terms of shape. And the shape of a molecule is very important in biology. The shape of the molecule really dictates its function. The structure of the molecule dictates its function. And so glucose and fructose, they have some things similar in common, but your body will be able to distinguish that those are 2 different types of sugar. And it will react slightly differently to those 2 types. So that's just an example. But the basic idea is that anytime you have a molecule or 2 molecules that have the same composition of atoms, but not the same arrangement or bonding shape of those atoms, that can be called isomers. And even more specific, there's a specific type of structural isomer that's called enantiomer. Enantiomer are structural isomers, but they more specifically are mirror image molecules. And here they're just using an example with carbon in the center, and then this X, this W, this Z, and this Y are 4 different atoms attached to that carbon. When you look at this, if you imagine a plane right down the center like a mirror, these 2, the one over here on the left and the one over here on the right, are mirror images of each other. And just like I said that the body will react differently to structural isomers of any type, it will react differently to enantiomers. So it typically, this comes into play when pharmaceutical companies are synthesizing drugs. Because when you synthesize drugs, when you create bonds between atoms, what tends to happen is what you create in the test tube, you create not only the drug molecule that you wanted, but it's very typical that you also create the enantiomer version of that drug. You have the mirror image molecule as well. And historically, the mirror image molecule is harmless, doesn't do anything, and so pharmaceutical companies just let it go. That is, up until the 1960s, they did, because there is a very famous case of a drug called thalidomide. And thalidomide was given to pregnant women. Here's the structure. It doesn't matter if you understand the structure. You can see this weird shape with these hexagons and such. And then in the middle here is supposed to be like the mirror. When they created thalidomide in the test tube, they also created the mirror image of thalidomide. And like I said, up until then, they thought, well, it's harmless, it doesn't do anything. They knew it was there, but they prescribed this drug to women, pregnant women, and it turns out it creates massive birth defects, this version. So this was the drug they wanted to give to the women, but they also gave them the mirror image version, thinking it was harmless. And in fact, it was what we call a teratogen, which is something that causes birth defects. And so there were a large number of children born after this drug was given to their mothers, and they're called the children of thalidomide because they have these massive birth defects. And it's considered the biggest drug disaster of recent history that happened in the 1960s. So nowadays they test and they're more careful about that. But up until that point, they didn't really pay attention to the enantiomers concept. Okay, so in this slide, I'm going to introduce you to the 4 categories of macromolecules or biomolecules. These are all based on organic compounds, hydrocarbons, which then have particular functional groups attached to them. So for each category, we will look at a standard example of the structure, and that's the only one that you have to learn. It's going to seem overwhelming at first, but you're going to be able to do it. So just stick with me. All right. So the 4 categories are: number 1, the carbohydrates; number 2, lipids; number 3, protein; number 4, nucleic acids. That doesn't have to go in that order. In fact, I think the way this lecture is going to go in the next couple parts, I think we do carbohydrates first. I think then we do proteins, then nucleic acids, then lipids, but it doesn't matter. These are the 4 categories, in no particular order. The carbohydrates and the proteins and the nucleic acids are all what we call polymer categories. In other words, they consist of individual molecules called monomers and large versions called polymers. So a monomer is just a single small molecule, which ends up being like a single unit. And a polymer is just many of those units joined together. So once you learn to recognize the monomer structure, then you can learn to recognize many of those joined together. It's, and sometimes we call it, it's like like beads, like little pop beads that you can pop together. You got one bead and you pop them all together, you've got a whole string of them. So each category has a different monomer type. And then once you know the monomer, you really have a sense of what the polymer is. So we will study the structure of the single units molecules and then look at the polymer molecules. The one category that doesn't have this kind of polymer or monomer structure is the lipids. So I'll deal with that one last. All right. Okay, so that's about 20 minutes, so it's time to take a break, or you can go on to the next part of the lecture.